Welcome. This is FAD 4451, and today we'll be talking about theory in human sexuality. We will cover 5 theories, or 5 perspectives, and some of the details of the theories within them. Evolutionary, psychoanalytic, social exchange, critical, and sociological. Evolution is the theory that all living things have acquired their present forms through gradual changes in their genetics over successive generations. The idea that the environment in which a species lives shapes their future genetics to make them more adaptable. Natural selection is a concept of evolutionary theory that is a process by which animals, also including humans, that are best adapted to their environment are more likely to survive, reproduce, pass genes on to the next generation. In terms of evolution, what counts is producing lots of healthy, viable offspring who will carry on genes. So individual happiness and things like that are not a concern. The evolutionary process occurs by natural selection, which as people or animals choose mates that are most appropriate genetically, the species slowly changes. The evolutionary perspective on sexuality starts with the basic assumption that all human behavior is largely the result of natural selection. They look into how do humans choose mates. One major criteria is the physical attractiveness of the person. And people who subscribe to this theory argue that a lot of the characteristics we evaluate in judging attractiveness, like somebody's body type or complexion, are actually indicative of health and vigor of the individual. So when you see somebody who's attractive to you, it may be that on a biological level you're recognizing that they are healthy and may be appropriate for mating. Sexual selection is the biological process of choosing a mate. It consists of 2 processes: competition among members of one gender, typically male, though in some species it's female, for mating access, and preferential choice by members of one gender for certain members of the other gender. So females choosing certain males based on preferences. Evolutionary psychology focuses on the psychological mechanisms that have been shaped by natural selection. And so they suggest that if behaviors evolved in response to selection pressures, it's plausible to argue that the cognitive or emotional structures evolved in the same way, and therefore all of human sexuality could be explained by the evolutionary perspective. Evolutionary perspective on human sexuality is an interesting way of thinking about perhaps why we do what we do. And there's certainly an element of human sexuality that is instinctual, that's basic, is not really something we have a lot of thought process about, which fits well with this theory. However, it has some serious problems. Critics really question the kind of data that's been used to support this research because it can't truly be tested. You cannot go back in time and watch the slow process of evolution. So instead, most researchers have relied on using more traditional tribal cultures of today for comparison to groups that are more white, Western, and wealthy, suggesting that the differences between them are somehow evolutionary. Problem is that it implies that the white, Western, wealthy cultures are better, are more advanced than the more tribal ones and more evolved. And there's not a lot to back up that claim. All right, moving to psychoanalytic theory. This is primarily Freud's theory, which can also be called a psychosexual theory. And it's been one of the most influential of all psychological theories about sexuality and other issues. Freud saw sex as one of the key forces in human life, and so his theory gives full treatment to human sexuality. The basic assumption of his theory is that there are two major forces that work in opposition that motivate human behavior. Freud saw the libido as being focused in various regions of the body known as erogenous zones. He was the one to first talk about erogenous zones. And as a drive, the libido promotes life, reproduction, creativity, etc. It's a positive force. Its opposite force is called thanatos, or sometimes called the death drive or destruction drive. And it's a tendency to behave in ways that are counterintuitive, self-destructive, aggressive, discontent. It's essentially the antithesis of libido. And it's as we grapple with these two forces that we make big decisions about our behavior, sexually, and he suggested in lots of other ways. So his theory of psychosexual development suggested that a child passes through a series of stages of development, and in each of these stages, a different erogenous zone is the focus. The first stage, which is about the first year of life, is the oral stage, where the child's chief pleasure is derived from sucking and otherwise stimulating the lips and mouth. And this is certainly based in reality in the sense that infants are drawn to their mouth. They use their mouth as a primary source of information. They put things in it, they chew it, they lick it, and make a lot of noises and actions with their mouths and lips. So in that sense, that's correct. Now, in the sense that that's an erogenous zone for them, that's certainly more questionable. Similarly, in the second year of life, he suggested is the anal stage. And during this stage, the child's focuses on their bodily elimination. Or he suggested this was the time of potty training, which often does happen in the second year of life. So in that sense, he's correct again. But whether it has anything to do with sexuality, again, highly dubious. Maybe I can go so far as to say false. The third stage is the phallic stage that lasts from about age 3 to 6. And at this stage, the boy's focus is on his phallus or penis, and he gets a lot of pleasure from masturbating. Perhaps the most important occurrence in this stage is the development of the Oedipus complex, which gets its name from the Greek story of Oedipus, who unknowingly killed his father and married his mother. It's a complicated theory that is absolutely incorrect, but suggested that young boys want to destroy their father and claim their mother for themselves. Not in such literal terms, but that psychologically that's what they desire. Again, no real truth in this. At this stage, girls feel cheated and they suffer from penis envy because this is the focus of this time period and they don't have one. And sort of complementary to the Oedipus complex is the Electra complex, which is a girl's desires for her father. He went so far as to say the desire to be impregnated by him. But again, absolutely no basis for this. This is a stage where a lot of young boys do get a bit obsessed about their penis, but otherwise there's really no basis for this. The latency stage, which is about 6 until puberty, implies that sexual impulses are repressed, that this is just not an age of sexuality, especially. And then with puberty, sexual urges awaken, and the child moves into the genital stage. During this stage, sexual urges become more specifically genital, and the oral, anal, and genital urges all fuse together to promote the biological functions of reproduction. So all these stages throughout childhood, he believes, sort of culminated and synthesized in puberty. I share this theory not because it's true, but because it was a huge part of the way people first thought about human sexuality in terms of a scientific way. And it's had a huge impact not only on research in sexuality, but even on just our way of thinking about it. We still talk about people who are orally fixated. That comes from the oral stage. People who are anal, that's a reference to the anal stage. It's had a much bigger impact than we often realize. Freud also talked about fixations. I already talked a little bit about those, with the idea that people don't always mature from one stage to the next. And so most adults have traces of their earlier stages remaining. So people who continue to be orally fixated, it's because they didn't resolve the issues of infancy. People who are anal, that's because they didn't resolve the issues around potty training, and they continue to have these problems. Again, no research to back any of this up. So his theory cannot be evaluated scientifically, largely because we cannot explore sexuality of infants and toddlers and young children the way he suggested. Most of his data that he built this theory on were derived from his patients, who were primarily very mentally ill individuals, and it was a very small group of people. He was also drawing information mostly from their memories of their childhood, which is known to be a highly unreliable method. He put a big emphasis on biological determinants of behavior and our instincts, so that your body basically forces you to do things. And it was highly male-centered. Although some of his patients were female, he tended to be rather dismissive of their development. So now we'll move on to social exchange theory, which comes from the basic assumption that people will choose their actions in a way that maximizes rewards and minimizes costs. It uses the concept of reinforcement to explain the stability and change in relationships with people, and it views relationships primarily as exchanges of goods and services among people. It assumes that we have the freedom of choice and that we often face choices among alternative actions, and that will choose the actions that maximize rewards and minimize costs. This theory emphasizes alternatives and how we compare alternatives. So the comparison level is comparing the profits one relationship provides over alternative relationships. Should I stay in this relationship or not? That decision is often determined by what you believe your alternatives are, according to this theory. Equity is believing that rewards are proportionate to costs in the relationship, so that you're essentially getting as much as you're giving. And this theory suggests that's really the key to a successful relationship and to successful sexuality. Matching hypothesis is that men and women choose mates who match them on physical and social characteristics. There is a rather large body of research that backs this up. We find that people are drawn to people like themselves, who are similar in attractiveness, who are similar in education, who are similar in values. That's essentially what the matching hypothesis is. Critical theories are theories that challenge our notions of many social processes by emphasizing the experiences of minority groups that have often been overlooked by previous research and theory. So we'll start by talking about feminist theory. First of all, it wasn't proposed by a single theorist. It's been developed by many scholars, some working together, some working independently. This theory emphasizes that gender signals status in a culture and that men have greater status and power, resulting in inequality. According to a feminist analysis, women's sexuality has been repressed and depressed, but rarely expressed. Sexuality in this theory focuses on many issues that demonstrate this principle. So it tends to have a focus on things like rape, abortion, birth control, sexual harassment, pornography, prostitution, ways that women have typically been repressed or depressed in their sexuality. Feminist theory highlights the importance of gender roles and gender socialization. We know that our culture has well-defined roles for males and for females, as do many cultures, but not all. In our culture, from their earliest years, children are socialized to conform to roles, and because of those roles, sometimes our choices about sexuality are restricted. That there are things that women do and things that women do not do. There are things that men do and things that men do not do. And that can restrict our expression of sexuality. Finally, intersectionality is an approach that says that you should simultaneously consider a person's multiple group membership and identity, including gender, race, social class, and sexual orientation. So recognizing that people are not just members of one group, but they actually may be members of multiple groups. It is entirely possible to be a woman who is African American, who is middle class and lesbian. And so she has a number of different perspectives based on her membership in all these different groups. And intersectionality suggests it's important to keep that in mind when we're thinking about people, that all of us belong to multiple groups. Another critical theory is queer theory. Over the years, queer has been used as a derogatory term, referring to homosexuals typically, but some people have embraced the word by sort of taking it back or reappropriating it and using it in ways that they feel are a better match to the experience of these sexual minority groups. Queer theory questions the social categorizations of sexuality and gender. It particularly challenges binaries, which is the idea that people fall into just one of two categories, and in particular the sexual orientation binary. So they challenge that people are either homosexual or heterosexual, and there are no other possibilities or spaces in between. Instead, they encourage people to think about sexuality and sexual orientation as something more fluid, more on a spectrum, rather than thinking of it as two categories. Queer theory also challenges heteronormativity, which is the belief that heterosexuality is the only pattern of sexuality that's normal and natural. Fortunately, heteronormativity has slowly been taking a back seat in our culture, and there's a more and more understanding that heterosexual is not the primary way of being or the only way of being, and there is more room for accepting homosexuals and bisexuals. But still, a lot of our social norms privilege sexuality and marginalize other sexual orientations. That without ever thinking about it, without knowing it, if you were heterosexual, you were benefiting from that, from the fact that our society still is largely structured in a way that favors heterosexuality over others. And queer theory is working hard to sort of reject that idea. Now I want to talk a little bit about the sociological perspective on human sexuality. Actually, a lot of research in human sexuality is done from a sociological perspective, which starts with the basic assumption that society is a critical influence on all human behavior, including human sexuality. So sociologists are especially interested in the ways that social interactions and our larger society shape our sexuality. Sociologists approach the study of sexuality with sort of three basic assumptions. One is that every society regulates the sexuality of its members, so every society has rules and norms around what's acceptable. That basic institutions of the society affect the rules governing sexuality. So those institutions can be formal, like the government, like our school system, but they can also be more informal, like religion, and more subtle forms of institutional rules. And then finally, that the appropriateness or inappropriateness of sexual behaviors depends on the culture in which it occurs. That it's really hard to evaluate whether something is appropriate or inappropriate without understanding the culture where it's happening. In our culture, it's perfectly acceptable to express your sexuality by wearing sexy clothes. To do that in a lot of Middle Eastern societies would be absolutely inappropriate and would be considered very deviant behavior. So it's a matter of cultural perspective. So basic institutions of the society, which includes religion, economy, family, things like medicine and law, all affect the rules governing sexuality in that society. In American culture, the Judeo-Christian religious tradition has been a really powerful shaper of sexual norms. Even if you yourself are not religious, a lot of your ideas about sexuality have probably been formed by a Judeo-Christian perspective on sexuality. The nature and the structure of the economy is also another macro level influence on sexuality. How free are you to make decisions based on your economic status, etc. The family is a third institution that influences sexuality. The family exerts a really important force on sexuality by socializing all children through families. So what the family believes, they pass on to the children, and while not every child accepts that, most do, and are at least influenced directly or indirectly by their family's views on sexuality. The institution of medicine has also become a major influence over the last century or so. That doctors tell us what's healthy and what's unhealthy. They are the ones we go to if we suspect we are engaged in some sort of sexual behavior that is not appropriate. So they shape a lot of our rules and norms. And then, of course, the legal system is another institution because we know that laws determine norms. They're also determined by norms. It's a bidirectional process that can be rather complicated. Laws are also the basis for all mechanisms of social control. The fear of doing something illegal is often what controls people's behavior. And the law reflects the interests of powerful dominant groups within the society, which is a big part of why Judeo-Christian religious tradition continues to be really important in our society, because members of that group who subscribe to those beliefs are the ones who are most likely to influence law in our country. At this point in time, they tend to hold most powerful positions. So sociology is looking at how each of these broad macro institutions shapes individuals' behaviors about sexuality. And that's all for theories. Have a great day.